Cool. I guess I can start with the intro. So, welcome everyone to this VanTUG event, summer edition, spring, first day of spring, right? A little bit of sunlight, flowers blooming. And flowers blooming is an interesting topic. There's a lot of new technologies out there, a lot of new things, some new to me and to everyone I talk to. And this topic specifically something that Matt keeps talking about. I always want to see it. Of like, Matt, come and do a talk for us at VanTUG. So thanks for accepting the challenge.
No problem, David, and thanks for coming out. Yeah, hopefully this will be a interesting topic for you to hear about. It's a loose retelling of a presentation that I have given at another conference as well. And it involves, I have to say, I'm a co-author on this one, but I know all the ins and outs of it. So this is, well, let's get started. Let's get into it here. So this talk is all about cloud native Windows workstations. And I've subtitled it here, what has Active Directory done for you lately? Because sometimes you have to ask the big questions, right? What does Active Directory provide in your environment? So I'm going to tell you about how one organization that I've worked with went from having domain joined config manager managed computers to AAD joined Intune managed computers in a single leap. What I hope you get out of this is a loose guide on how to do that, what worked for us, and most of all, a reminder to be fearless. Very often when we are doing things with technology, we will let what has happened before be our guide for what we're doing next. And sometimes that serves us and sometimes it doesn't. So a little bit about who I am. My name's Matthew Armitage. I work here at Steves and Associates with David. I'm first and foremost a parent of two girls. Hopefully during this talk, they will not make too much noise outside of my office. I also have a few hobbies: smart home enthusiast, amateur non-destructive entry enthusiast, which just means I know how to pick a lock when it's on my desk and is clear. That's the amateur part of that, by the way. I work at Steves and Associates, as I said. I'm Microsoft Cloud Solutions Architect for them. And I am an IT professional. It says 20 years here. I mean, do you count all of the stuff before I was even paid to do it? I've been pretty passionate about IT for most of my life. So 20 years on the professional side, there's about probably a little bit more than that if you count all of the playing around I did before I went pro. One of the other things that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about where this organization was before this whole setup went. And in order to talk about that a little bit, I also wanted to have a demo that happened. Now, demos are the bane of any presenter's existence. They almost always fail. So apologies if it does fail. If it does, that is presentation in a nutshell, and we'll roll with it. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch the camera view, and we're going to take a look at a machine that I've got set up here that is ready to autopilot. If you've ever set up autopilot before, you'll have seen like this kind of a screen when you've got a machine that's ready to join an environment. And we're actually going to autopilot it live. So to that end, I'm going to go ahead and sign into this. This, of course, is in a demo environment. It's not actually a customer's environment or my environment or anything like that. This is just, I whipped up a quick demo environment to demonstrate some of the things that we will be talking about. So I'm just going to go ahead and log into this thing and kick off the autopilot process. It's probably going to say, oh, my session timed out. That's because I've had this sitting at this login screen for quite some time today in preparation for this. Now, as this thing does its autopiloting, it's not going to be very interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this, and we're going to put the little autopilot in the bottom corner of the screen here so we can keep an eye on it during the presentation. And then I'm going to come back to where we were before we started doing this autopilot approach. And this should be pretty familiar to everyone on this call. We were using, Active Directory for our identity source and our computer joins and all of that. We had SCCM set up with, SCCM automated updating and all the packaging that goes along with that and application packaging and everything. We had on-premise print servers. Ooh, those are fun, aren't they? Everybody loves an on-premise print server. And lastly, we use group policy to configure our machines because it is a centralized policy management tool. I mean, that's what group policy is. We've all used group policy. We're all very familiar with group policy. Not a big deal. In addition to this, we had a lot of cloud SSO applications. So, we were using Azure AD as our identity source for those. And we had AAD Connect set up and synchronization between our on-prem and Azure AD. So the environment was, both AD and Azure AD. We were very much in the hybrid area. But our devices, though they be hybrid Azure AD joined, were not, hybrid. They were managed on-prem. And I mean, this has a bunch of problems with it that we'll go over. And many of those problems, of course, are related to the fact that in this day and age with, post-COVID and pandemic and all of that, our devices weren't on-prem. And despite the fact that we had always on VPN schemes and that kind of stuff going on, it just, our management of these devices was starting to slip. Right? It wasn't the good old days that everything was inside the network perimeter. Line of sight to domain controllers was a given rather than a maybe, right? It was, wasn't quite cutting it anymore. And so as an organization, we had a decision where we wanted to simplify everything. We even coined a phrase about it. It was actually, and this goes all the way back to 2018, right? So we coined a phrase, simplify 2018. Now, of course, it's still, took more than just 2018, 2019. Simplify became the byword, and we just attached a year to the end of it as we kept on going. And one of the things that we wanted to simplify was we didn't want to have as much on-premise infrastructure because it turns out that getting people to manage on-premise infrastructure, and that is hard. And the more stuff that you can have that is SaaS, the less, kind of IT ops or, IT data center management you have to do, and the more ops and, automation and whatnot you can, pivot your team towards handling. So where we wanted to go to this lovely cloud here, right? That was the goal. But we were realistic. So, and we were an organization with some legacy stuff kicking around. So quite obviously, we still needed to print. And unfortunately, we still had some on-premise shares we still needed access to. So at this point, we made a plan. Now, the plan was to do this kind of move towards the cloud, nice and slow and smooth, and, turn on co-management and set up hybrid Azure AD joins and autopilot in the cloud and have that do a hybrid AD join on-prem. And the regular kind of nice slow approach to this, right? Where we, still have AD and still use AD and still, do our group policies on-prem and stuff, the stuff that we were familiar with and comfortable with, right? And then just start pulling in some of that stuff from the cloud. We'd actually had some success with Intune management already. We had some devices that were sort of cloud native. They were, Intune joined, they were Azure AD joined, but they were like niche cases, right? They weren't like our line of business computers. They weren't, the regular, business users were not using these kind of computers. They were like in labs and, small deployments and stuff, right? So we were working on this whole thing, and we were at one point we asked we asked the question, why do our devices need to be on the domain? And I mean, it was like a question your values kind of moment, right? And one of the top reasons we could think of was we needed access to like, domain joined resources, stuff like shares, right? It turns out that there's this really cool ability. If you have a synchronized account from on-premise AD to Azure AD, and you log in to a cloud native, completely non-domain joined device with that synchronized identity, you actually, if you have line of sight to a domain controller, also important, you actually get a Kerberos authentication and you get access to on-premise domain resources completely without any need to actually join the domain. This seems like magic. So what I'm going to do here is our autopilot session has been going quite quickly in the background here. I'm going to switch us back to looking at this thing here. And this is just a very basic environment. So it has Windows Hello on by default. And it requires me to authenticate into this and set a PIN code for this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. The account I'm signing into this has already been set up for MFA. So I just need to approve that. And we're going to set a little pin here just as soon as it gives me the pin prompt. And at this point, this machine went from a essentially out-of-box experience. I'm going to say no on this because I don't really care. To a device. Now, a device that you can log into anyways. There's a lot more that I would go into for a full autopilot deployment, obviously, but this is the basics. Like this is dial tone, right? We've got a device here that is logged in. It has, SSO. It's got a Azure PRT, a primary refresh token on it. This is a generally ready to go device. Now, I mean, if we were going to move this into like a production thing, we'd probably want a few applications installed, and probably some more configurations, and maybe less advertisements. But if we go to office.com, take a look at this thing, let's sign in. And of course, we're going to sign in because this is a cloud native device. There's nothing shocking here, right? And we'll even open up a command line. You can tell it's a demo because there's all sorts of Contoso branding around it. We'll do a who am I? And this is, Nothing too shocking there. And we'll do a quick dsreg cmd/status. We'll take a look at this thing. And we'll see here up at the top, device status, Azure AD joined, yes. Enterprise joined, no. Domain joined, no. Device name, demo plus a serial number. And that's, I mean, this isn't shocking at this point. But in this file explorer here, I think I need something on-prem. So I'm going to go take a look at the sysvol on our domain controller. Remember, I'm not joined to the domain here. This seamlessly did a single sign-on to a domain resource. I can do the same thing to this file server here. If we take a look at the properties of this thing, we can see in the security here, we can actually, this is an on-premise, this is the on-premise side of my synchronized cloud identity. Nothing here, this machine is not connected to the domain. And yet, I can even add this domain printer to the machine. Now, normally when I am doing this demo, I like to do it in a client's environment because setting up Autopilot doesn't actually take that long. And if you fire up Autopilot and you log into it and you're not on a domain joined device and you start accessing domain resources, we'll usually start freaking out a little bit. So that's one of the gists of this talk. And one of the things that I really want you to take away from this, that is possible. You can just not join the domain and still get access to shares. What about printers? Well, as we can see, we just did a printer there. Now, one of the downsides, of course, of this is that you can't really push a printer with Intune in the traditional Windows way, right? We can't set up, like a policy in Intune that maps an on-premise printer. So universal print is actually generally the accepted way to handle that outside of the domain. But for various reasons in the organization we were working in, that did not work. Universal print was just not what we wanted. First of all, because for legacy printers, it requires an on-premise print server. And that was just not something that was going to work for us. So for us, we instead pivoted and decided to use Printer Logic, which is a third-party application for sure. But one of the nice parts about Printer Logic, and I'm not getting any referral fees from them for this talk, it's just I like it because it doesn't require an on-premise server at all. So it uses Azure AD as its identity back source. If you wanted to, it can use on-premise AD if you want, but we weren't going to use that. And serverless, yet another server and whole system that we didn't have to support on-prem anymore. So that was nice. So we've solved shares, we've solved printers. What's the next thing that's left of our list of things that AD is doing for us? Obviously, policy. Now, it was at this point that my colleague and I looked at each other and said, okay, if the only thing holding us back from having to do domain joins and having to, move into this modern thing, the only thing that's holding us back is GPOs, well, let's ditch our GPOs. Now, nobody likes GPOs these days. If there are people in this audience that do like GPOs, I'm sorry, I'm going to slag on them a lot. I don't particularly like them. Between WMI filtering eating up login times and all sorts of hierarchy, trying to figure out messes. And the fact that GPO has been around for a long time, so especially in the organization we were working in, this was a legacy mess. I'm sure that there are organizations that are handling this way better than ours did, but ours at the time had things like Office 2010 and Office 2007 policies that were still kicking around, right? And just to be clear, Intune's not going to solve that problem. If you don't ever clean up your messes, you're going to have a mess in Intune as well. But we took this as an opportunity to do what we called a clean sweep. We were going to evaluate all of our GPOs. So the first step of that was to review the currently applied GPOs. That led us to this little meme here. They were all garbage and all over the place and contradictory everywhere. So we decided that let's not do that. Let's not even consider the idea of migrating GPOs. Now, it's not impossible to do a GPO migration to Intune configuration profiles. There are some pitfalls that you should be aware of and some best practices around that. I'm not saying that that's a bad idea, but for this story, it was going to be bad. So instead, we decided to take the minimum viable product approach. Again, this is part of being fearless, right? Like a lot of people are afraid to touch their GPOs because it's this house of cards that you've been building over years and years and years. And the idea of, taking one of those out and examining it and deciding whether or not you're going to keep it, it can be scary. So we decided to leave the house of cards alone, and that was going to support the legacy environment as we switched over to the new environment. So we asked the question, what do our devices really need? And if we're going to do that and we're going to start over, what does the device persona for in this case, staff device look like? And it turns out, in our environment, at least, this was it. There wasn't a lot that we found out that we actually had to set. Some firewall settings, block a few other settings, but by and large, the defaults were pretty same. So we changed as little as we had to. Now, since then, of course, this has grown because that's what policy does. It gets bigger. But in this instance, this is what we started with, and it provided enough of a base for us to get started with the project. The next thing that we had to deal with was the fact that migrating applications from SCCM on-prem to Intune is not a click and drag kind of thing, right? At the time, especially when we were doing this, this was happening early, I'm going to say 2022. Actually, we started in 2021 with the staff approach for this one. The new Windows Store wasn't available in Intune yet. There were some other things that were missing, and we essentially were going to have to repackage everything. Which, of course, led us to finding a better solution. And the better solution was Patch My PC. The reasoning behind this is many. Patch My PC is a fantastic product. I'm a big fan of it. We're a partner here at Steve's, but even before I worked at Steve's, I was a big fan of this product. So I feel comfortable, talking about it that way. One of the nice things about it, and there are other options for this, you don't necessarily have to go with the Patch My PC route just because I love it. But one of the nice things about this and other third-party patching products is that they build your applications for you. So you get an application catalog that you can just start with. So it turns out that in-house applications, or applications that were not part of the Patch My PC catalog, were very few and far between compared to what was in the catalog, and therefore ready for us to just click a box and have an Intune for us. So we went with Patch My PC. I would strongly recommend some kind of thing like this, although it's not as important now that Microsoft has gotten the new Windows Store into Intune. Picking apps and packaging apps is getting a little bit easier. Keeping them fresh is getting a little bit easier. And of course, Microsoft is coming out with their Intune Suite product that's going to have some third-party patching in it as well if you want to pony up the money to Microsoft instead. So there are options here, but if you're going to go down this journey, I would highly recommend considering some of these options. So what about updates? We were using SCCM for updates before. I'm an endpoint, like I like endpoint. I nerd out about endpoint. David is fond of calling me an endpoint nerd. I have nothing against SCCM and its automated updates, except for it's backed by WSUS, and I hate that product. WSUS, had a day in the sun, and that sun has set, and now it needs to go away, as far as I'm concerned. Sure, if you need to have an on-premise source for your updates, and you need to be able to approve or deny each update individually, I don't know why you'd be doing that in the world of, roll-up updates. But if you need that, sure, WSUS has a place. It's going to make your life painful, and you're probably not going to be happy about it. But yeah, it's got a place. However, updates in Intune land are a little bit different. They're what I like to call the WSUS model, and the SCCM model is an approval model of updates. You are, even if you're using automation to do it, you're essentially choosing to approve updates from Microsoft to be pushed out in your environment. Intune's model with Windows Update for Business is, of course, not only exclusively Intune. You can do this with group policy and some other ways, right? But Windows Update for Business is a deferral model, right? So instead of saying, we approve this update, it's going out to our environment, we say, we're not sure that we're ready for that update yet, but we will be in a little bit of time. It's a bit of a flipping it on its head. So, and it turns out that this kind of model is generally more successful at getting updates into your environment. So this was a net win for us. We found after the switch over to Windows Update for Business, managed by Intune, that our update, was just, our updates were much more successful. We had much higher uptake and much quicker uptake, depending on our rings, right? So that was pretty simple. Updates are easy. So this all just, as I demoed, right? Like this worked. Autopilot is relatively quick, depending on how many applications you're pushing down. I didn't really push down a ton with ours, but I've seen the organization where these things are actually live. We've got like 30-minute autopilots with that's like 2 desktop usable machine ready to go. And at the previous version of this talk, we did it at a conference on the conference Wi-Fi during the talk, and still had a successful autopilot to demo by the end of the talk. So it was pretty good. So what did work then out of this? Well, policy. To put it in a word, we simplified the amount of policy in our environment drastically, and the policy application was much more successful than group policy. We had some machines that, had problems on them and weren't getting group policy. We had machines that were not connecting to our always on VPN, and so hadn't refreshed policy in a while, and were living out in the wilderness, as it were. Intune policy just solved that. It just worked way, way, way better. And we had reporting showing us that it was working. That was the really the other really nice part about this is that we had that reporting from Intune saying, yes, you set a policy, yes, it applied, no, there weren't any errors applying it, and we could track that over time even. So it gave a nice little feedback loop about our policy as well. Printer logic was a home run. It was just way better than anything we had before. We had group policies with printers, and we had all kinds of like scripts that we'd used in the past and all kinds of stuff, and they would always end up with problems. You'd go to like replace the driver on a printer that's pushed through group policy and it was just a mess. Whereas printer logic was just like, yeah, this is the driver you want, the agent enforced it, right? Like it was just worked better. So that was pretty nice. Let's go back here. Other things that worked really well. Autopilot is really effective. However, it's also a big departure from imaging and task sequences in SCCM. So there was a learning curve for the rest of the IT team in the organization. Still a little bit of ongoing, and there was also a bit of a learning curve from our users, right? Because one of the things that we used to pride ourselves on was when we handed a machine to our users, it was ready to go. There was nothing they need to do but log on and it was ready. Like even in the past, we'd had such high touch things as like, oh, we're going to make sure that this icon is here on the desktop kind of thing. And with Autopilot, well, I mean, you can do a lot of crazy things with PowerShell scripts. We took the hands-off approach and said, if the defaults don't work, why? And if that answer is because it's people aren't using the operating system in the way that's optimal, that's not an IT failure necessarily. That's something that we need to educate our users about, right? Like how to properly use these tools that we're giving them. So we did that. And part of that was making them a part of the actual deployment experience. So no longer was it they were being handed a device that was like owned by IT in like obviously and just like given to them and they get to like log into it, but that's it. They all of a sudden got a bit of a sense of ownership about them because when they unboxed them, they went through the setup process. They answered questions, limited. I mean, we were still controlling all of that. That all, gave them a little bit more investment in the device themselves, which helped. It actually helped. The other part about this is that we hadn't gotten to the point where it was just drop a machine or drop ship a machine to somebody. It still was a centralized organization. People came to IT to get their devices, that kind of stuff. But it got to the point now where a staff member, instead of having to run through some stuff in the office, they could take it home and do it at their leisure. They could go home and log in and do the autopilot provisioning, and it didn't matter. It didn't have to be anywhere we were, which meant it really opened up that ability that if we needed to ship something somewhere and just drop ship it as quickly as possible, we could. It's great. The other thing that we changed was Autopilot has some, not say strict, limited naming functionality. Because it's a cloud native machine, one of the nice things is that you don't have to rename a device from the actual device. You can rename it from the cloud, which is lovely. But we decided to shift from our previous naming convention that we had that was very rigid and very static and actually referenced locations quite a lot to a much simpler just identifier and serial number, right? Which was actually quite successful because in the Intune dashboard, of course, you can search for devices by user, primary user, that kind of stuff. And it just gave us, we found we didn't need the naming convention as much as we had in the past. So now with every story, there are caveats, right? Some things did not go super smooth. One of the ones that didn't was this bit here. because we decided to go Autopilot kind of halfway through this process instead of doing SCCM, we had about 100 devices that were due to go out to staff members, and none of them were Autopilot registered. We learned a very important lesson here, and that is that Autopilot is much faster and easier for distribution of devices if they are Autopilot registered before you get them from your vendor. If you don't get them from your vendor Autopilot registered, be ready to type a lot of PowerShell into a lot of individual machines. There's a whole process for doing it. It's also not the best way or the most secure way to onboard devices to Autopilot, so I like to mention that as well. But yeah, this took time. There's a nice script that does it and everything, but it's still a lot of effort. And that's one of my number one takeaways from this. If you are going to go down the Autopilot route, or if you're even interested in the slightest of going down the Autopilot route, really, really consider getting your vendors to register your devices for you. There's no real downsides. Like if a device is registered to your organization for Autopilot, that's not going to, if you want to image them with SCCM or with MDT or with whatever imaging process you want to use, that doesn't matter. The Autopilot only triggers at the first page of the out-of-box experience on a device. So if you're doing imaging, Autopilot's not going to get in your way. But the opposite is not true. If you don't have Autopilot, putting it on it's not insurmountable, but it's a bunch of work. So that was problematic for us. This was the other big miss. Everybody in our organization, in the department, loved the config manager remote control. And yes, remote help exists, and or team viewer, and or pick splash top, pick your remote assistance method. All of them cost money, and recognizing that SCCM also costs money, so that's where this cost is coming from. It doesn't cost additional money on top of SCCM, whereas remote help from Microsoft and all of the other options cost additional money. So this was kind of a we ended up using Quick Assist, which I would not recommend going forward, and they're moving to TeamViewer, but yeah, consider how you remotely support devices before you move forward with this kind of approach. The other one is that yeah, we haven't got there with this organization for all devices. Some of the desktops and stuff like that should be using things like self-deploy, the Autopilot deployment method where you don't have to log in as a user. Some devices that works really good on. And in fact, there were some kiosk machines that we set that up, and it was like magic. If the device was Autopilot registered, you plugged a network cable into the back of it, plugged the power cable into the back of it, monitor keyboard, press the power button, and it just turned into the kiosk it needed to be without any other intervention. You didn't have to touch anything. It was just done in under 30 minutes, ready to go, exactly what it was supposed to be. The self-deploy, that requires TPM 2.0 on a device, which is a valid security measure that's needed for that, but it does mean that legacy devices that didn't have TPM 2.0, we had a whole set of white box devices that didn't have a TPM at all that we had to manage. Those things can't do that self-deployment. And so imaging hasn't entirely left the environment, but is pretty close at this point. In fact, they've decommissioned SCCM at this point. So things that we learned that we should have done differently. Get a partner. There are many. VARs can do this too. Get your devices Autopilot registered. It is the single most important thing that we could have taken away from that. It would have saved hours of work, just hours of work, and would the carpal tunnel from some of our poor technicians. So yeah, that one, definitely get a partner. Oh no, we're going ahead of that a little bit. Yeah, that was one of the big ones. Things that are still Autopilot, bit of a moving target. It's gotten way better. When we started this process, we had some devices that had from the factory 2000 or 2004, sorry, Windows 10 2004 on them. And since 21H2 and higher, Autopilot has gotten a lot better. It self-updates the Autopilot code every time it checks into Autopilot now. So if Microsoft does find like a bug or an edge case in Autopilot, it's fixing itself now. But we had to, because of the fact that Autopilot was using the code that was shipped on the machine, we had to actually manually update some machines to a different feature level in order to get Autopilot working the way we wanted in our environment. As I said, Autopilot with self-deploy, which is a really cool technology and a really cool idea, it requires TPM 2.0. So it kind of locks it away from older machines, right? And the last one is Patch My PC is great. It's fantastic for everything that's in its catalog. Stuff that isn't in its catalog still needs to be bundled, managed. It's fairly time-consuming, handling application management and stuff like that. So, takeaways. Domain join is not needed to access domain resources. That's it. This is crazy to me. With all of my IT years of knowledge, I can't believe I'm saying this, but domain join is not needed to access domain resources. I should add, it's not needed to access domain resources, domain join and domain login. You don't actually have to authenticate. If you have a synchronized user, this is an AAD Connect function, so you need AAD Connect for this. But if you have a synchronized user from on-prem to Azure AD, when you log into a cloud native device, if there is line of sight to a domain controller, you have a Kerberos token, you get, or a ticket, sorry, you have Kerberos ticket, you get access single sign-on without any further authentication. It's like magic. Group policy, it WMI really slows down logins. There's lots of legacy there. It can't reach beyond line of sight to a domain controller, all kinds of things. Can't verify that group policy is actually successfully applied without like running reports on the machine. Group policy is last decade. We're in the 2020s now. Configuration profiles in Intune are just better. Get your devices Autopilot registered by your vendor. It'll save you hours. Even if you're not going to use it today, sometime in the next couple of years, you're going to consider it and you're going to hate the fact that you have to register the devices yourself. And I'm sorry, Microsoft, Windows Print is better with third-party apps. It just is. I'm sorry. So that's pretty much everything I had to show you. Normally, the Autopilot thing takes a little bit longer, but we're at the point here where I'm ready to accept questions from everyone. Is there anything from this that anybody particularly wants to ask? Anything that jumped out or was like, oh man, I need to know more about that? And David, I can't see the Q&A thing because I'm on the new Teams client. So if people were asking in the Q&A function, I'd appreciate it if you could relay those to me.
I will. No, no questions at the time.
Okay.
Let's see if someone comes up with something. Yeah, but that's very interesting that you can get the Kerberos ticket.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's a Kerberos ticket and a primary refresh token. Primary refresh token is your Azure AD, and your Kerberos ticket is your on-premise SSO.
cool. Yeah, I always heard you and other people saying that this was possible. Um, it's the second time I've seen it. The first time you showed me, I was like, no, don't show it to me anymore. Let's make it a VanTUG event.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly because of that. It's yeah,
It
someone who's been
goes
working with
against.
AD for years, it's just shocking to see how unnecessary AD is nowadays. And I had the pleasure to present on the TechEd, both North America and Europe in 2012. And I had a session called Intune for the Enterprise. You can imagine 11 years
Mm-hmm.
ago, Intune as a
Wow.
product had nothing. So
Mm-hmm.
we struggled a lot to fill in 1 hour, 15 minutes of session with enterprise content. So we had a lot of storytelling and some jokes and some manufactured uh, kind of uh, things that we had to say to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's a full blown product, and it's interesting to see how many people are actually replacing or completely replacing SCCM with
Yeah.
Intune and other features. Right? You still need a few other products to get to functionalities that's similar. But hey, it's pretty close.
Yeah. The organization I was talking about during this conversation, because this was a real organization that did all of these things. Um, they have at this point, I think, over 2,000 devices managed by Intune and cloud native only. Yeah, they basically, and it quickly, right? I mean, it's 2023 now, but they went from like on the domain was the norm to on the domain is now the edge case. So it is, and it's moving fast. And the other part that I didn't talk about was like the user experience of this. Um, it turns out that people really, really liked this model. When they were given the device and they signed into it and it did like the, hey, we're setting up the device for you, they felt a lot more engaged in the device. This is, by the way, survey reports. And then the other thing is, I'm going to show this again here. One of the things, it's hard to tell on this because this is a VM, right? And it's running co-local with the DC and the file server that I'm connecting to for this. But one of the things that got everyone was how shockingly fast it is. Um, it seems like the access to the shares is faster using the single sign-on than regular on-prem credentials. And I can't explain that, so that's anecdotal. But yeah, it has been uh, pretty amazing to just like show people that. I've done it in a number of organizations now. Um, if you have a chance to do an endpoint management workshop with us at Steve's, it is one of the key things that I do during the endpoint management workshop, because if there's an opportunity to show this off, I always do. It's just people go, wait, what? And then I say, hey, why are you joining things to the domain? You don't need to. Look at this. You just access your file share in your printer without being on the domain. It changes the dynamic of how people think about their migrations to Intune.
Yeah, and in the end, it's all about user experience. All we do is to make sure that people are productive, get their machine up and running, they have access to everything they need to work, and that we have policies in place to prevent from them, doing what they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah,
Especially
yeah.
that last bit. I mean, the enable productivity.
Yes. Well, to enable or to disable non-productivity is how I like to say it. To disable non-productivity. Yeah. But yeah, the other one that's really good about this is to, oh, and I see a question here, and I'm going to address it in a second, Diane. The other thing that I'll note is that a login with Intune configuration profiles generally is faster than one that has group policy, especially if the organization is using lots of WMI filters in their group policy. I've seen this be like a key driver of this. Just like, hey, our logins are so much faster this way. Of course, we're going to do that. And
on the
Diana,
point you just mentioned, and related to user experience as well, people using VPN struggle to apply policies afterwards. A configuration profile will apply as long as you have, or refresh as long as you have internet connectivity. And by having the machine not check policy, even if it is on a always-on VPN provided by the company, you don't have all this processing, query, and reply time. So it is turn the machine and start working.
Yeah. So Diana's asked a question here. What training do I recommend in order to get this to work in the field? Honestly, I mean, you want to know your way around Intune, but Microsoft offers for fast track eligible people, and David's the real knowledge here, so I'll defer to him on the actual eligibility. But there's a workshop that you can get sponsored by Microsoft that is called the Endpoint Management and Security Workshop, and it gets you like, what can you do with Intune? And that's usually a really good starting point for this, because if you do the endpoint management workshop, one of the things that gets set up during that workshop is Autopilot and a walkthrough on how to get Autopilot working in your environment. And then the rest of this, like I said, this works so transparently that I tend to just throw in this non-domain join test with people that are doing the workshop. It's not even part of the curriculum of the workshop really, but it doesn't take any time to do, and it's so engaging. So I do it every time we're doing the workshop if it's possible with the client that's working with us. So I would start with an endpoint management workshop. That being said, I mean, there's lots of good training sources for learning Intune.
What I recommend is Microsoft consolidated the 2 exams for this function. So this function used to be split across 2 exams, the MD 100 and MD 101. They just published the course for MD 102. And it will be a single exam instead of 2 to get the certification to operate Intune. That's how they call it now. So anyone working with endpoint management will go through this exam, but the course is already available. So if you look for MD 102, the whole course is there, and it covers a lot on Autopilot. And it will mention that those things are possible, but there's links to the articles where it will explain what the prerequisites are for Kerberos to work on cloud native machines and so on. And then from there's a chain of Microsoft documentation. But hey, there should be plenty of content as well on YouTube. There's a big tech community, right? Like this one. There's a lot of MVPs creating content.
Learn.microsoft.com is actually pretty fantastic. It's the makeover that they've done on that, and like kind of they tried to gamify learning a little bit there. It's pretty spectacular. And like David says, their learning ties into their certifications. Those certifications are very helpful for getting work in this field. Experience also. Getting to play with this stuff is helpful. Any other questions? Anybody have anything they'd like to pick my brain about on this? Could you let me know if this model is suitable for a development group? So I would say yes, in that the autopilot approach, like I showed you this demo on virtual machines, right? And this isn't like Windows 365 virtual machines. These were things that are just running on Hyper-V on my machine, right? But the actual deployment, like through Autopilot and like pushing down things like Visual Studio 2022 and that kind of stuff, all of that can be handled. Docker, I wonder if you could package up Docker and push it out with Intune. You can do, if you can do it with PowerShell, you can do it with Intune. So yes. Now, if it's a powerful enough, that's like if we're talking like remote machines versus laptops or whatnot, you might be thinking more along the lines of like Windows 365 and their like remote cloud
Yeah,
PCs and stuff
I
like
was going
that.
to mention that, right? So Microsoft has a SKU of Windows 365, which is the cloud version of Windows, called DevBox. So that's
Mm,
meant for developers to use and abuse, as they always do, without permission. Um, and this is made to have a kind of working machine as a test machine. And the test machine, you can just right click and reprovision, and it uses Intune on the background to reprovision the machine.
yeah.
So it's exactly the experience we see here. But instead of building one machine once, you have a cloud machine that you can use for your day-to-day work, plus a test machine that you can rebuild using exactly this process, up to the standard you want. So you can create an image that includes Visual Studio, Docker, whatever other tools you need. You use it as much as you want, and then if you want to reset it, you right-click, reset, wait, 5-10 minutes, and then you can log in again.
Yeah. But I mean, if we're talking like remote tools, that David's right. That's what I would point you towards. Especially that kind of environment where you want to be able to reset things pretty quickly. Yeah, that's VDI and Windows 365. Or yeah, Windows 365. Yeah, those are the tools you'd use for that. As far as whether or not it's powerful enough, that depends on how much you pay for those servers, for those machines, right? Um, I'm not sure about prohibitively expensive. That really depends on a whole bunch of metrics I can't evaluate right now, but it's not a $0 cost. Let's put it that way. Any other questions, even loosely related? We're pretty easy.
Well, and one more thing before we start running out of time is if you guys can suggest any other topics or talks that we'll organize at VanTUG, let us know in the chat or in the group discussion at Meetup or email me. Anything works. The idea is to put sessions that you guys are interested and make relevant content.
And before I close off, I want to make sure that my co-author of this presentation and my buddy who we built this together, Jonathan, gets a little shout out here too. So there is both my information if you wanted to reach out to me individually, and John's information as well. If you want a I won't say less biased, but if you want another opinion on this. And he okayed me showing that. So
Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions.
okay,
Thank you, Matt, very much for this presentation.
very
You'll
welcome.
be the very first video on our new VanTUG website that's going live in a few days. So
I'm honored.
yeah, and hopefully we'll get you back for another session, you know,
we'll
after
talk
9
about
months,
the other
that's our
really
cool
fun
down
project.
period, right? So people don't get
Yeah,
tired of
fair
your
enough.
face.
Fair
Um,
enough.
but I think you can contribute a lot to the group on a big variety of topics. I keep calling you the endpoint nerd, but you're more like a global nerd than just endpoint. So
Well, I appreciate that shout out, David. I'll have to get a new tattoo, right?
yeah.
All right.
Right.
Well,
Thanks, Mac.
thank you.
Thank everyone.
It's been fun. I hope you all have a good night, and thanks for coming out.